Good morning. Joining us now, Bruce Klingner. Bruce is a former CIA Korea Deputy Chief and Heritage Senior Research Fellow. Bruce, thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Well, thanks very much for having me.
So we keep hearing South Korea being held up as something to, I guess, to strive towards as far as dealing with the coronavirus. But is it all good news?
Well, they employed a very vigorous testing program. They got off the dime very quickly. But they also have monitoring requirements that may seem too intrusive for the U.S. to implement. So it is both, I think, lessons for things that could work, but would also perhaps cause some concern if the U.S. government was to implement it.
And what are some of those things that you think would concern the United States that have contributed to their success?
Well, it's a thing you can argue really on both sides, because we're all involved in combating the COVID virus with quarantines, et cetera, that any measure is good. But the government has access to bank records, to lots of security cameras, to the GPS information from your phone and your car, as well as your credit card transactions. And so that enables South Korea to track people so that if they are identified as having the virus, then they can notify people in that neighborhood or who may have come into contact with them, whether they need to get tested as well. So on the one hand, it's very effective in enabling South Korea to flatten the curve on the COVID virus, but it's something that would be, I think, more difficult to implement in the U.S., but it's going to be something that perhaps we need to discuss as the virus continues to trouble us.
Yeah. And in fact, the president was asked about this yesterday, the idea of GPS tracking, and he referred to that as a severe idea. He seemed opposed to the concept of GPS tracking Americans. So that gives us some indication, Bruce, of the likeliness of that happening. And at this moment, that seems slim in the United States.
Right. But what the other things that South Korea did was get started early. The first case of COVID in both the U.S. and South Korea were on the same day. It was January 20th. But while the U.S. seemed to dawdle in its response, South Korea, within a week, had convened a meeting with representatives from 20 different medical companies. They got them working on test kits with very little red tape, very little bureaucracy, more of an entrepreneurial approach. And a week after that meeting, they gave approval to the first medical company to do the test kits, and then other approvals came after that. So South Korea was able to have a pretty massive testing program, and they also didn't have restrictions on who would be tested, like in the U.S., where it was only people with severe cases or severe symptoms who had traveled to China or been in contact with people who had traveled. In South Korea, people were being tested with no symptoms or very light symptoms, and that enabled sort of this very targeted monitoring and notification. So South Korea didn't have to do the massive shutdowns as we've done in the U.S.
Are they using test kits that are not approved here in the U.S.? That seems to be a hurdle. There are some complaints that the FDA is restricting too much and changing the requirements for coronavirus test kits, and so they're just sitting and waiting, some of these companies, for approval, for instance, for at-home test kits. And there are some complaints about that. Is there a difference in our test kits?
Well, the South Korean ones seem to be very effective. South Korea is obviously a very technologically advanced country. They were doing 10,000 to 20,000 tests a day at a time when weeks after the first case had been identified in the U.S., we hadn't even done 10,000 tests cumulatively. So they had a very effective testing program, and now they're talking about exporting their kits to a number of countries, including the United States, and apparently President Trump has asked for help from South Korea.
Yeah, but we just stipulate that South Korea's population is dramatically smaller than the United States,
yes.
and we have done, as just a cumulative matter, way more tests than South Korea has done at this point, no?
Right. Well, it took us about 8 weeks to catch up to what South Korea had done. So even a couple weeks ago, South Korea had done 300,000 tests, and the U.S. had only done 100,000. Mm-hmm. And then now I think the more manufacturers are coming online, so now we've had a surge in production. But it's something we wish we'd done, 4, 6, 8 weeks ago.
So what is, if you could pick something specifically going forward that South Korea did that we should adopt, what would it be?
Well, I'd say there were 4 things. 1 is starting early. 2 is reaching out to industry with less red tape and enabling the industry to move forward. 3 is the testing, and that's the main one. And then 4 is the monitoring and the notifications, which is the bit more controversial. But in South Korea, the notifications, it's really quite amazing. If you hear some of the notices, someone on their phone will get a message of, this person in your neighborhood has tested positive. He went to this restaurant. He went to your bank. He was here at this time. He went to a restaurant where he was not wearing a mask, et cetera, et cetera. And if you move around the city, people will get new notifications based on their location. So very effective, but as we said before, it's something that may not work in the U.S.
Yeah, I can't see that working in the United States at all. Like, I'm cringing right now even listening to this because my neighbors don't need to know my medical history. But can we have the same success as South Korea without having that piece to the puzzle?
Well, it will be less effective. And one thing to point out is that when people get notifications, it's not with any names or identities. It's just a dot on your phone, which tells you, so that's something.
Okay.
But people could be concerned about the government having access to credit card information, bank information. But if we were to discuss it, it may be something that, in a future crisis, that the government could only have that power during a pandemic, and that perhaps Congress and the executive branch jointly would have to declare it. So again, it's something I think we're going to have to discuss,
right,
whether we do, a full program like South Korea or some kind of modification.
Now, Bruce, I don't know if you can answer this, but I'd love for your assessment on it. Is there any role that Korean culture plays in the response to the virus that's different than in a multicultural society like the United States?
Well, I think perhaps the bigger factor was that in 2015, South Korea felt very impacted by the MERS epidemic. And the administration in office at that time took a lot of criticism because there were a number of Koreans that were affected or died, and the testing seemed insufficient. So that's when they implemented a number of procedures and changed some legislation. So I think it was that to South Korean very searing experience that enabled them to respond quickly and gave them the inclination to respond quickly. So and then in Asian cultures, people are more frequently wearing masks, even just during the normal winter, and that's to either prevent themselves from getting infected, or if they have a cold, to prevent infecting others.
Yeah.
So I think there's a bit of a cultural thing just in the fact that more people will wear masks there.
Yeah. Interesting. So interesting. Bruce Klingner, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Oh, well, thank you for having me.